welcome back. We're talking with Jesse Eisinger, author of the Chicken Poop Club, for lack of a better, you can find it easily. Why the Justice Department fails to prosecute executives. Jesse, what provoked you to write this book?
Well, I wrote a lot about the financial crisis, and that was what my colleague and I won a Pulitzer Prize for at ProPublica for coverage of how the bankers took advantage of the bubble and prolonged it and profited from it at the expense of average Americans. And then we waited around for the prosecutions because we thought we'd uncovered some seriously questionable, probably criminal behavior, and nothing happened. And it was so confusing to me that I started writing and thinking about this and realized that we have a white-collar prosecution crisis in this country. And as I was saying earlier, that it goes beyond the banks. It's not just about the financial crisis. So I wanted to understand what the changes were at the Department of Justice that resulted in this crisis.
Right. Back in the 1980s, in the early 80s, there was this ideology that had been building for arguably 20 years or so, 30 years. It came out of Milton Friedman's work in the 50s at University of Chicago, and Hayek and Mises and everybody else, they were all in on it. This idea that a company is actually, its shareholders, that the shareholders own the company, and therefore everything the company does should be directed to supporting the shareholders. And prior to this, prior to the two principal changes that flipped this, it had been against tax law to compensate executives for their labor with stock. You could let them buy stocks, but you couldn't. And there had been this top 74% tax rate, both discouraging executives from taking like $1 billion, like Stephen Hemsley has taken from United Healthcare. And therefore, prior to that, CEOs had to respond to the community, to the institution of the company, to the employees, to the customers, and to the stockholders. When they changed the executive compensation rules so that the majority of executive compensation came via stock options, then all of a sudden the executives no longer had any commitment to any of these people. It was a major philosophical shift that led to where we are right now, where breaking up a company, no big deal. And prior to Reagan, that was considered a disaster, a moral disaster. Screwing a community, no big deal. Stealing the pension fund and getting rid of the employees, no big deal. That kind of major shift usually takes decades of kind of psychological priming to get us to, and it did. It was a 20-year campaign to change the rule about executive compensation, which Reagan did. And I'm wondering, was there a similar philosophy and campaign to stop the prosecution of white-collar criminals?
Yes, it does build over the 40 years or so, exactly in a similar way, is in a way that I try to trace in the book. So what happens is that in the 1960s and 70s, the Department of Justice, primarily the Southern District of New York under Robert Morgenthau, and Stanley Sporkin at the Securities and Exchange Commission start to focus on a higher class of criminals. Before that, they've sort of focused on two-bit crimes like Ponzi schemes and boiler room operations. And they decide we want to go after bigger CEOs. And we also want to go after their enablers, their accounting firms and their law firms. And they prosecute them criminally. And that's a big change. And then what happens is defense law firms, the white-collar, white-shoe defense firms, end up realizing that the Department of Justice is going after these people, their clients. They start representing them, and they start recruiting prosecutors to represent them.
Hold that thought.
Okay.
Jesse Eisinger.
Well, I think they just go by New America.
New America,
now.
okay.
They dropped the family.
Yeah, and author of the new book, the Chicken Stuff Club, the Chicken Bleep Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. And so we were talking just a second ago about how many of these fairly large sea change policy issues, policy changes that kind of seem to come out of nowhere actually have 20, 30-year campaigns prior to them, ideological campaigns, and then an actual on-the-ground corollary happens as a result of events. Yeah. And you were telling us how, and in fact, if you could recap it, how it is that we went from prosecuting criminals, white-collar criminals, to essentially not prosecuting.
So it sort of develops symbiotically. The Department of Justice and big law kind of start changing in relation to each other and then influencing each other. So the Department of Justice starts to prosecute CEOs individually. They recruit, big law firms recruit prosecutors, and then the Department of Justice starts to shift to kind of focusing on corporations, which turns out to be huge business for these big law firms. In fact, it's preferable to represent a company in an ongoing kind of prosecution of the corporation, because you get to do the investigation, the internal investigation.
For the
it's
money.
very lucrative. Yeah, it's ongoing business instead of doing these one-off investigations of individuals. So it turns out that it's sort of a very symbiotic thing that develops over time. And today there's a very seamless and troubling revolving door between big law firms and the Department of Justice, where the hotshot young people train as prosecutors, for 6 or 8 years, then they go become partners at law firms. They rise up in the ranks of these law firms like Covington and Burling or Wilmer Hale or Debevoise and Plimpton. Then they go back and run departments of the government prosecuting, quote unquote, corporations.
Right. So is that a piece of the whole revolving door problem, that you have
Absolutely.
regulatory agencies that are now flowing people back and forth with industry, and so they start going soft on industry?
I mean, it's worse than that, I think, because what people don't understand is that the dirty little secret is that we have outsourced and privatized corporate investigations to the corporations themselves. It's sort of like asking Pablo Escobar to hire a law firm in Medellin to figure out whether he's a drug dealer or not. Doesn't work very well. So what happens today is that the Department of Justice allows corporations to hire law firms to investigate whether there's some wrongdoing. And then those law firms deliver the results to the Department of Justice. Now, some of those investigations are very good and professional, and sometimes prosecutors, of course, rise above those to investigate on their own. So this isn't something that happens all the time. But often those investigations are sort of studiously incurious about lines of inquiry that would take you to the CEO. And of course, that stands to reason, because they want the ongoing business with the corporation.
Well, the CEO is the guy who hired them, right?
Right. The CEO and the board has hired them. And let's say that there's a falling out and that they have some leave to investigate the CEO. In this case, the next company is not going to hire them to do the same job. So there's an enormous amount of pressure to have a kind of reasonable investigation that, if it fingers any individual at all, it's kind of low man.
It sounds like you're describing the creation of a cover-up industry.
I mean, it essentially is a kind of payoff industry. Corporations pay checks to absolve them of crimes. The right, with some merit, says the Department of Justice is able to get corporations and extort them for money and make them write checks and name their price. And I think both of these criticisms have merit, because we can't really, as the public, figure out who's on the right here, because we don't see the evidence, because there's no evidence.
By right, you mean correct.
Correct, exactly. So, there are these critiques on both the left and the right, and they're both valid, because the evidence isn't put forward, isn't made public, and there aren't any trials anymore. What we need to return to is trials of executives that make the evidence public, and then the public can see it and assess it.
It's been a long time since I've seen a corporate perp walk. I mean, they used to be a staple.
They don't really do that anymore.
And I mean, even Reagan deregulated the S&Ls. 3 years later, they collapsed, as everybody predicted. And what did he do? He threw a bunch of people in jail. I mean,
well, there was
Charles Keating and buddies.
Exactly, Keating and Milken. My view is that there used to be a Republican idea of a kind of law and order ideal, and where they wanted to keep capitalism safe from bad capitalists, from crooks. And so they would prosecute individuals. And so Stanley Sporkin was a Republican. Larry Thompson, who was the Deputy Attorney General under George W. Bush, and Ashcroft is a hero in this book because he prosecuted the Enron. He helped create the task force. Robert Mueller, who's the special counsel now, he was the head of the FBI. They both helped create the Enron task force to go after Enron. The Democratic response, which has merit, is to say these are systemic problems and we need systemic reform. We need more regulatory oversight.
At the very least, stuff like Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, well, Glass-Steagall, then or Sarbanes-Oxley, which I think had some benefit. Dodd-Frank, which I think was woefully inadequate, but actually made things slightly better. And what the Democrats have underestimated and misunderstood is that you need to put people in prison, CEOs in prison, both to not only that to deter crime, but also to have legitimacy to your reform efforts. Because if you don't couple your reform efforts with accountability, then it looks like the reform efforts are weak, which they often are, because you're not holding people accountable.
Right, right. So are you seeing any motion in this direction?
No, I mean, it's the opposite. I mean, I'm a big critic of the Eric Holder regime at the Department of Justice. And I think Jeff Sessions, if he lasts the week, is going to preside over a Department of Justice that's much substantially, an order of magnitude weaker on corporate enforcement. I think that the old Republican idea of a law and order, preserving law and order, is utterly dead.
Jesse Eisinger, the book is The Chicken Beep Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. Thank you so much.
Thank you for